Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, our ongoing study in the theology of Karl Barth. We're going to take a look at some secondary literature here now. We're going to take a look at a introductory volume written for the Church Dogmatics by Adam Neder. It was published by John Knox Press in 2009, and it's a fairly good introduction, so we're going to take a look at it. We're going to begin with the first chapter, pages 1 through 15, which deals with epistemology. Now, if you look at block 1, we're going to begin by looking at our union with Christ. And the author tells us that Revelation is an event where God establishes an ordered fellowship between humanity and himself, and Revelation is inseparable from reconciliation for Barth. It is an event of mutual indwelling of God as Word and of man as participation. So the union event is the revelatory Word, which is not a predicate of man in his own ability. It has to be a revelatory Word that encounters us from without. But it is a revelatory Word mediated through physical event. It is always concrete and always addressed in a specific way to a specific individual. And it's through this first step of enabling that the new man and the new situation is created, which makes possible the reception of revelation. And it's a process of a kenosis unification, which takes place through the rhema voice of Christ, which lifts us into unification with God the Father, restores our communion with God. And this revelatory event also leads us toward knowledge as practical wisdom, as phronesis. So it is an event of union between God and man, but not a synthesis. Barth said it's always reciprocal between lordship and obedience, not a synthesis. It's always lordship of Christ and obedience of humanity. Lordship of Christos as Kyrios and the obedience of humanity. So revelation is always revelation event. It is always is revelatory event for Barth. In addition to this, the revelatory event is self-actualizing. We don't actualize the revelatory event. It is a self-actualizing event. God's Word distinguishes itself as a self-distinguishing mystery. The revelatory Word comes to us through the veil of creaturely form, but God remains distinct from all mediations of revelation. Even our reception through faith is under God's control. Faith is a miracle of veiled revelation. So it's entirely a sovereign event for Barth. The revelatory event is a sovereign event empowered by and brought to fruition by God the Father through Christ. Even our faith is a gift in the revelatory event. And our secondary language is always in need of ongoing sanctification because revelation is always beyond conceptualization. So this entire process of kenosis unification is a process of unveiling, and that will lift us into unity with God's self. So for Barth, clarity becomes the binding agent of this uplifting kenosis unification. The clarity of revelation, as it continues to become more and more clear, further lifts us into kenosis unification with God's self. So for our summary statement, we can say that the revelatory event and the revelatory event as self-actualization both lead to revelatory event as a reformed Christology. The revelatory event constitutes a reformed Christology. The Word comes to us through the mystery of its secularity or its incarnation. And kenosis unification is a dynamic personal fellowship between God and man, And God maintains this fellowship through his lordship of Christ as Lord. So from here, we want to take a look at block 2 and take a look at the concrete implications of this reformed Christology, and how does this revelatory event become concrete. And the revelatory event becomes concrete as our epistemological event of knowing, and so we're going to take a look at what constitutes concrete knowing in block 2. And knowing passes through the stages of, for Barth, klesis call, and then knowing as union, and then knowing as euthutes. So it's klesis call, henosis unification, and euthutes. Those are the 3 steps of the knowledge of God. Let's look at note 1 in block 2. Knowing as the klesis call. The knowledge of God is from above to below. Knowledge comes to us as a gift. Faith is not a natural possibility for man. Self-understanding is acquired through the reception of the promise of the gospel. Knowledge is not a synthesis between the divine and humanity. Instead, it is a correspondence to word, as a corresponding occurrence of divine grace and human faith as 2 sides of a singular revelatory event. And it takes place within the moment of hearing Christ and his klesis call, that existentially implicating klesis call of Christ. And the klesis call of Christ creates the knowing as union in note 2. Knowledge of God is a miracle of grace, a union of Christ and believer. It begins with the event of a syntaike, or the event of divine urging, and then the self is enabled or made new as anakainidzo, which means to renew and restore, and that makes possible our act of free faith. So there is an urging of the Father as he draws us to Christ, or that syntaike urging of the Father draws us toward the klesis call of Christ. And we receive the anakainidzo, restoration and renewal, that makes possible our faith response. So urging and enabling lead to right hearing, the right kind of hearing, where the word is actualized within our own existence to create existential knowing. And that's in 2e. The urging of the Father, the enabling of the Spirit, creates right kind of hearing, spiritual hearing. And then the word becomes actualized, and we can internalize an existential knowing. And this right hearing always leads to obedience, therefore it becomes an event of correspondence, an event of mutual indwelling. The revelatory event always becomes concrete as mutual indwelling, and always obedience on our side. So 3, if you look at block 2, note 3, for a summary statement, we know that the klesis call of Christ and the henosis unification of being lifted to restored fellowship with the Father both lead to this all occurring at a point of contact. And that point of contact, says Barth, is the image of God, the subjective image of God that dwells within us. It's called the euthutes, or the image of rectitude, or the image of uprightness. So the image of God is the image of euthutes, spiritual uprightness, that dwells within us, and that becomes the contact point for this revelatory event to occur. That's the foundational apex that dwells within us to make possible this enabling of spirit, so we can have a free response of thankful faith, and it makes possible this moment of divine knowing. So it does take place in this point of contact. It is the euthutes, and that is our possibility for receiving the Word of God. Through faith, we are henosis united with Christ's Word at our euthetes center of being. And that's when we first see ourselves, says the author here. And he gives us kind of a summary triad at this point for the first two blocks. We begin with the suntaike. The revelatory event begins as the Spirit persuasively urges us toward Christ to hear the klesis call of Christ. This is the work of the Father. This is that suntaike urging of the Father to draw us toward Christ and His Word. That's step one of revelatory event. That's step one of a divine epistemology. So it all begins with the Father suntaike urging us toward the klesis call of Christ. The second step is the anakainidzo, and that's the enabling of the individual in order to actually have the possibility of positing a free faith because of the restored union which occurs through Christ. So the first moment is the act of the Father. The second moment is an enabling by the Son. So it's suntaike by the Father and anakainidzo by the Son. That anakainidzo enabling is by the Son, by Christ. And that leads to an actualized revelatory event as a euthetes apex center, which becomes activated and actualized, and that is that the image of God as rectitude or as spiritual uprightness, that becomes the center point in our life that is addressed, and that the event of revelatory event centers itself and takes place. That is where we are persuaded by the Father in His suntaike persuasion, and that is where we are enabled by Christ in His anakainidzo enabling. So we have the Father's suntaike urging, or as the Gospel of John says, drawing near. We are drawn near Christ. So we have the suntaike urging by the Father and the anakainidzo enabling by the Son, which leads to the actualization of the euthetes image of rectitude, of spiritual uprightness, of the image of God that dwells within us. And so if we look at block 3, we can take a look at the summary statements here. This actualization of euthetes, it is a mystical union. It becomes a singular but two-sided event of our conformity to God. We are mystically adapted to the Word of Christ. It is a act of prosago, or we are brought forward to Christ's Word. So that suntaike is a suntaike or a prosago. It's an urging or an actual prosago bringing forward to the Word of Christ by the Father. The union of event is enjoined by the inequality of the decisions, because of the two sides, there is God's side of the divine lordship in this urging and enabling, and the human side is one of obedience and correspondence. Those are not equal decisions. One is divine, one is human, but the Lord acts in His divine lordship. We respond in obedience because we can, because we have been suntaike persuaded and anakainidzo enabled. Then we can respond in obedient faith. And so for the final summary triad, the author gives us the euthetes as prosago. God in His lordship brings us forward to Christ's Word. God in His lordship brings us forward to the Word of Christ, the klesis call. Then euthetes as hupakuo can take place. This enabling creates a possibility for us to actually have the ability to hear spiritually. We actually have the gift of spiritual hearing. And through the gift of spiritual hearing, the revelatory event can take place as obedience, and the mutual indwelling can take place as that actualization within the image of God which dwells within us. And so we end up with this bringing forward of the believer to the klesis call of Christ, the enabling of spiritual hearing, and then the corresponding faith act of obedience and thankfulness, all because the Father has suntaike urged us into this revelatory moment, all because the Son has anakainidzo enabled us within this revelatory event, and all because from the very beginning we've always had the image of God dwelling within us. So we have the presupposition of the image of God dwelling within us, which has never gone away. We have that as the gift of creation from our Father. But then we have persuasion and urging from the suntaike of the Father and the anakainidzo enabling of the Son, which creates a powerful triune revelatory event. It becomes triune revelatory event. So our author here, Adam Neder, begins in chapter 1 with addressing epistemology and Barth's dogmatics, and it is spot on. It is right on. This is exactly the way I read it also, the way I studied it. I do think that he is 100% accurate here. I think this is a precisely how we can look at the epistemology in the church dogmatics. It is absolutely a sovereign act for Barth, and our faith response is always a gift, always an empowerment or an enabling first, so that we can respond in obedience. And that's going to wrap up the first chapter, and we'll pick up next time in chapter 2.